Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Mejd, and I'm managing the Cambridge Initiative for Planetary Science and Life in the Universe. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, Didier Queloz, Jacksonian Professor of Natural Philosophy at the Cavendish Laboratory at the University of Cambridge and part-time Professor of Physics at ETH Zurich. He is at the origin of the exoplanet revolution in astrophysics when, in 1995, during his PhD with his supervisor, Michel Maillot, they announced the first discovery of a giant planet orbiting another star outside the solar system. They received the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physics for this discovery that kickstarted the rise of exoplanet research. Please welcome Professor Didier Queloz.
Thank you, Mejd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to be with us today. I think today it's a day of a celebration because that's the beginning of something we believe will grow, will develop further, and that's about the origin of life and the question of life in the universe. When you think about this, it's quite fascinating because you have this understanding that we have a pretty decent understanding of the functions of life these days. But when you think about how this started, I think we essentially know nothing. And that's exactly the idea here of this initiative, is trying to develop an approach, rational approach, fact-based approach on something which is very profound. Well, the question is actually pretty ancient. I mean, if you go back in the books, I mean, you will find this very nice sentence that was originally in Greek from Epicurus, 300 years before Christ. The idea that we will be one amongst many, and there will be many of us in a way, as we can see the life on Earth, I think was already on the table. And this idea makes sense because it's pretty clear. It's connected to our place into the universe, and you see all this history and revolutions about trying to place us into context. And we've made a tremendous amount of progress actually on this understanding, and some of them being made at the very place here in Cambridge. But still, I think on the specific of life, we're a bit at the beginning here. Why do we have this initiative now, and why is it going in Cambridge? So I want to briefly try to kickstart this discussions, and there will be more opportunity later on during the panel to get a lot more elaborated debate on that element. I do think we are at a very special moment into the history of science. And the reason why, because there is three different ways that is seeing life and the question of life. Well, the first one is we have this avalanche of planets that we have been detected these days, and it's more than been detected. They're being weighted, they're being scaled, they're being studied. The atmosphere of these planets is being studied, and this is something that will definitely continue, and it has completely changed our perspective of how we fit in. We are one system amongst many, and many of the systems are rather different from our own system. So actually the interesting element for life into that is, I think, the role it plays as a stimulus. I always, tell the story, it's an anecdote. When we had the first planet detected, that was a giant Jupiter roasted, where you cannot even think that there will be any life. I think most of the media question we had at that time, was 25 years ago, is it life on that planet? And it seems that the connections about the possibility of life elsewhere, and it's also applicable to the Venusians, to the Martians, to the Jupiterians, and you can look back in books, in 100 years books, and they will imagine the kind of creature living on this other planet of the solar system is embedded into the idea of discovering planets. Well, right now there is a kind of a drastic change. We are detecting planet. We're measuring atmosphere of planet. We're detecting molecule in this planet, and this is happening at this very place of Cambridge. There are people working on that in different departments on that topic. So this is the first element of the story. Well, the second element is we're having a kind of an amazing experience. We don't really realize that every day, but we have an amazing robot right now, which is moving around, drilling, digging out, and studying rocks on Mars. And this idea of studying Mars in great detail has profound implications, because we still see Mars as a kind of archetype on the early Earth, certainly for the first billion years. And understanding the chemistry of life is a way to telling us about the chemistry of the past of the Earth, at a time when we know that life started to be developed on Earth. So that's the second element here. It means we're having a lot of data coming, a new data coming, and we will have in about 10 years matter coming, rocks coming from Mars to Earth to being studied. And who knows what are going to be seen with these rocks. And the third element is the progress that has been made in the chemistry and biochemistry on that topic. There is various reasons for that. I think there is the new techniques of analysis of the data. There is the use of the computers. There's many different aspects that has made this progress, more relevant. And there is a situation right now where we do have, let's say, some pathway for the origin of life on Earth. This is being tested. This is being simulated. We don't have the complete pathway, but there is enough element to believe that this pathway is maybe leading to one day being maybe tomorrow, to somebody claiming that we understand all life, though life as we know it today may have come up on Earth just from the chemistry perspective. And we have the chance to have the very top of that development as well in Cambridge. So you understand right now that in this very place we have people that both working on the exoplanet, people working on a Martian experiment, people working on the study of the planet of the solar system, and people working on the chemistry of life, including the chemistry of the atmosphere. It's very unique, I think, and very unique in terms of specific situations. So it's because of all of this that this initiative exists. And actually, the whole purpose of the initiative is trying to bring this element together. And essentially, there is three elements that we're trying to achieve with the center. We're not going to do the science. The science is not the purpose of the center. The center purpose is to enable the science. So what do? We bring some mechanics, some oil into the machinery. We're going to help a little bit with the fundings. We're going to help to make happen maybe some cross-discipline works. It's not easy. We all know it may be difficult to get funded in some case when you are just at the interface between two different silos of fundings. We're trying to enhance something which is essential here, which what we call networking in a more liberal sense, is can we understand each other? Can we just fight the jargon? Can we just learn from each other? And that's another big focus for the center. And the third one is, can we all learn something new together? Can we develop a new way of thinking about this topic? Can we learn through the cross-disciplines maybe something that we would not have thought? That's the idea of an initiative. And there's something that is bubbling around since a couple of years here. I know it's a reality with this launch event. And it's a reality really made possible. And I really have to really state and acknowledge this very strongly here. First, by a very strong support from the School of Physical Science that was with us, understanding the interest to bringing different departments together on a topic which is of high relevance of that one, and a very supportive attitude and contributions for the department parts of the initiative, including the Cavendish Laboratory, Department of Earth Science, the Yusuf Hamied Department of Chemistry, the Institute of Astronomy, and the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics. That's really essential for this launch. Without their support, it would not be possible to be doing this launch as of today. Now, I would like to acknowledge that I'm right now talking to you, but actually this initiative is the work of about 20 people behind. So really thank you for all of the work. It would have been impossible for me to achieve that level without all your works, ideas, and contribution to this initiative. Now, we're reaching a level where we are launching the events, we are having the machinery in place. So I would like to give the floor now to the managing director of this initiative, Mejd Alsari, who is going to tell you what exactly you can hope practically from this center and how it's going to work. Mejd, please. Thank you.
So yes, I'll give an overview of the practicalities of the program. If anyone is interested in being part of the IPLU community, I invite you to join our mailing lists, and you can find this information on the website. One of the main goals of this initiative is to improve communication across the departments. And so to keep our website and social media channels alive, I encourage people to share any news, events, or research. And please contact the Hub email, and you can see that on the slide if you would like to share anything. And if you use Twitter and you like to tweet about your work, then please feel free to mention IPLU's Twitter handle at Cambridge IPLU. There's also support for interdisciplinary research on planetary science and life in the universe through the Initiative Research Fund. So if you would like to receive these updates, I encourage you to join our mailing lists. As Didier mentioned, we will be hosting a series of networking events, and that includes coffee meetings, which will be held every other Thursday. Each meeting will have a theme. Basically, these meetings offer an opportunity for people to talk about their research in an informal setting, maybe give an informal talk or discuss a paper. And if you have any suggestions regarding themes or would like to give a talk, please contact Paul Rimmer, who's organizing these meetings. Starting from Lent 2022, we will host seminars to share expertise from outside Cambridge with our community. And these seminars will be held on a Thursday, once per term, and they will be held at the main lecture theater at St. John's College. We will also have 101 introductory lectures, and these are basically an opportunity for people to learn topics outside their area of expertise, and they're ultimately focused on knowledge exchange within the IPLU community. These will also be held on a Thursday, once per term, at the Tilly Lecture Theater at the Department of Earth Sciences. We will also hold the IPLU Science Day on Monday, February the 7th at Selwyn College. And the aim of this day is basically to bring together people interested in the topic and is an opportunity for postgraduate students and postdocs to present their work. We will soon share the details of the format of the event with the mailing lists. And if you have any questions about any of these meetings or would like to suggest anything, please, again, contact the Hub email. And I will now hand over to our moderator to introduce our panel, Liba Taub, Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge and Director and Curator of the Whipple Museum of the History of Science. Her main research interests include the history of scientific instruments and models, as well as science and mathematics in Greek and Roman antiquity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Liba Taub.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to introduce the first of our panelists, Nikku Madhusudhan, who is a professor of astrophysics and exoplanetary science at the Institute of Astronomy here at Cambridge. His research interests span a wide range of areas within exoplanetary science, and he is credited with pioneering the technique of atmospheric retrieval to infer atmospheric compositions of exoplanets. He is also extensively involved in state-of-the-art atmospheric observations of exoplanets with large facilities in space and on the ground. He leads a research group working on various aspects of exoplanets, particularly their atmospheres, interiors, habitability, and biosignatures. Madhu recently edited a book on the future of the field titled Exofrontiers, Big Questions and Exoplanetary Science. Alex Archibald is professor of atmospheric chemistry and climate science at the Department of Chemistry. He is a team leader for the National Center of Atmospheric Science. His research interests include understanding the coevolution of Earth's atmosphere and climate, particularly how human influence has modified it during the Anthropocene. His group developed the UK Community Atmospheric Chemistry Climate Model and support the UK Met Office and NERC UK Earth System Model. This group used numerical modeling and AI to improve our understanding of the evolution of Earth's atmospheric composition and how we can find solutions to minimize deleterious impacts on health and climate. Nick Tosca is the professor of mineralogy and petrology in the Department of Earth Sciences. His research group focuses on understanding the long-term evolution of planetary surfaces and their environments by using experiments, observations, and theory to unravel the chemistry of fluids that formed and modified ancient sedimentary rocks through much of Earth's earliest history. He is also science team member of the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover mission, which you've seen on the screen, currently exploring the ancient surface of Mars. Nick's principal role on that mission is planning and executing experiments and sample selection with the rover and helping to understand the chemistry of the fluids that formed and modified the deposits preserved in and around its landing site, Jezero Crater. Emily Mitchell is a paleontologist, a NERC research fellow in the Department of Zoology, working on understanding the origins and early evolution of animals on Earth. She herself has a very interdisciplinary background with an undergraduate degree in physics, a master's in mathematics and ecology, and her doctorate in earth sciences here at Cambridge. Her interdisciplinarity gives her a novel take on evolutionary biological questions, enabling her to use different mathematical and ecological approaches to understand the key drivers of early animal evolution from an ecosystem rather than an organism approach. So, now that you've met all of the panelists, I'm going to ask each of you if you will speak to your own involvement in this exciting initiative and also the place of your own discipline within it. And if I can turn to you first, Madhu.
Thank you. Thank you, Liba, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. It's great to be here. We have been working on this, and thanks Didier for leading this effort, and to all the departments and the school for really supporting in a big way in getting us started on this venture. Now, I would like to first echo Didier's, what Didier mentioned is that we really are, what I personally also think is that are in the golden age of exoplanet science. And maybe for the first time begin to answer some fundamental questions of is there life elsewhere? My group here at the Institute of Astronomy works on a wide range of topics related to exoplanets, but more specifically atmospheric characterization and also connecting the atmospheric properties to their possible interiors and interfaces, the surfaces and so on. Before I go more into detail on what my role would be in this initiative, I would like to take a step back and talk a little bit about Cambridge Astronomy to get the big picture. As you all probably know, Cambridge Astronomy is operated across 3 different departments: the Institute of Astronomy, the IOA, the Physics Department, Cavendish Lab, and the Department of Applied Math and Theoretical Physics, DMTP. And across these departments, if we talk about just planetary science, exoplanetary science, we cover a broad range of expertise, which is what makes an initiative like this possible, to get like a holistic understanding of planetary systems across the board, planetary processes and so on. So just to briefly touch upon, to give you a sense of the kinds of things we do here. So we start all the way from how planets form. So at the IOA and DMTP, there are various groups. Our colleagues work in areas related to planet formation, but specifically with regards to this initiative, groups are involved in trying to understand the fundamental building blocks of planets, which eventually go into establishing how, what are the materials available for life to form on these planets in the first place. And also not just planet formation processes, but also planetary environments, the debris disks around the planets, and what sort of material is available to impact the planets later on. So from that, you get a really broad understanding of planetary system processes. And then we come to the planets themselves, and there are groups in the maths department who also work on dynamics, dynamical interactions between the planets and the rest of the system. So we do a lot of that as well. And then as far as the planets themselves are concerned, in Cavendish, as well as at the IOA, we lead various efforts, global efforts on planet detection. So Didier is sitting right here, pioneered exoplanet detection. But even at the very cutting edge today, detecting small planets, we're very much at the forefront of that. So planet detection is a big thing here. And looking into the future, we are involved in various efforts in detecting small planets around nearby stars and habitable planets, both around sun-like stars and other stars. So from there, we go on to characterization. My group and others, our colleagues, are involved in a lot of atmospheric studies. And within that, we do both observations and theory. Right? So we are involved in some of the state-of-the-art observations with large facilities out there, you name it, HST, the Hubble Space Telescope, James Webb Space Telescope, which is about to launch, is what we understand, in next month, hopefully, if all goes well. But also large ground-based telescopes, the 8-meter class, 10-meter class telescopes in the world, and future telescopes, the 40-meter class, 30 to 40-meter class telescopes that are coming in this decade. So that's the observational landscape where we are involved in, but we also work on a lot of theory on exoplanetary atmospheres in trying to understand the fundamental atmospheric processes, be it chemistry or various other processes, how the temperature structures operate and how those connect to the interiors and how planetary surfaces operate and so on. So this is a broad brush of all the things that we do, and you'll find very few places in the world which have capacity, just the scientific capacity at the very high level to operate across all these disciplines, and that is really the key asset we have here at Cambridge, which makes an initiative like this possible. So now, like in a couple of minutes, to zoom further into what my role is in this center, again, we come back to atmosphere. So traditionally, I've been working on a lot of different areas within atmosphere. So we developed some of the first atmospheric retrieval techniques, which is to extract the atmospheric properties from an observed spectrum. Until now, until recently, we have been focusing on large planets because those are the most observable ones, the giant planets. But in recent years, just in the last couple of years, we have begun to measure atmospheric properties of smaller planets. We are talking about planets smaller than Neptune, around 2.5 times Earth radius. And we are very soon going to smaller and smaller planets, reaching almost Earth-sized planets very soon with James Webb Space Telescope. So one of the major areas my group is involved in is just these state-of-the-art observations in the next decade, within the next 10 years. What I strongly believe is that we would be able to measure atmospheric compositions of planets in the habitable zones relatively accurately. We are already beginning to do that for large planets, around 2.5 times Earth radius, but we'll get to smaller planets as well. And I lead one James Webb Space Telescope program in that direction, but there will be much more effort happening. So that's one thing that we will be doing. And then we'll be working on a lot of habitability aspects of these planets. So far we have been focusing in the field, in general, we have been focusing on Earth-like planets, terrestrial planets, when we talk about habitability. And one of the areas I'm interested in, and we have done some recent work on this, is how to extend that to challenge our own notions of habitability on Earth. To basically explore if we can go bigger, hotter, whatever planetary bulk parameters there are, to see if there are other places out there that are habitable. So that is another key area that we'll be working on in the context of this center to answer the life-based questions is, what are the extremes of habitability that are possible out there? So you can see where we are coming from. We'll do a little bit of theory to establish where to look for life, and then we'll do the observations to possibly find signs of those lives. So those are two broad areas. And then a third area is to develop these interconnections between various disciplines, between astronomy, various parts within astronomy, and also between astronomy and various other areas that my colleagues here are going to talk about, be it chemistry or biology and earth sciences. There is a very rich landscape here. So I'll end here. Where basically, so I talked about what my involvement will be in very brief, and we can expand on that in our session here, and where Cambridge Astronomy sits. But that's only one part of the whole center. We have all the other disciplines. So you can begin to imagine the picture we are bringing and to the initiative, and the long-term view is to be able to combine all the efforts together to perhaps get a holistic understanding of planetary systems and life in the universe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madhu. And I think we'll move from astronomy to Alex to speak about his part in the initiative, but also that of chemists.
Thank you. So I'm here to represent chemistry, and it's really difficult to do that, I'll be honest, because chemistry itself is a discipline which spans huge diversity in topic. What I'm going to focus on is things like the chemistry of gases, which is a rich topic which Cambridge has a huge heritage in. Nobel Prizes in the early part of last century for fundamental work on the chemistry in the gas phase, to some of the work that we're doing now in our group, trying to understand how our own Earth's atmosphere has changed over time and how we've affected it and how that's affecting climate. What strikes me is that the chemistry of gases is really important in this whole question of trying to understand about life in the universe. We could think about the chemistry that happens in the aqueous phase, in the liquid phase, but what we're seeing, and as Madhu kind of has been focusing on for much of his career, is what's out there in the gases on these envelopes that surround planets. But what we're challenged with is a range of molecules, a range of conditions which chemists are just not used to studying or have given up on studying many decades ago. What's really quite interesting, if we think about the chronology of atmospheric chemistry, is that really about 30, 40 years ago, many of the who are now titans in the field dabbled in the chemistry of Mars, the chemistry of Venus, then got focused on to things like smogs and air pollution and things like that. And now we're going full circle again. Now, with the discovery of exoplanets, actually, we're going beyond that. We're going to thinking about this much richer part of chemical space to investigate. Some of the challenges, though, are really immense, which is where I think things like theory will become an increasingly important tool that we have to use. So colleagues of mine, particularly Alex Tom, I don't know if he's here or for those of you that know him, they're developing theoretical approaches and theoretical methods, sometimes based on AI as well, which are really unlocking some of the mysterious secrets of the chemistry that happens at high temperatures under high pressures that we're able to see in planets like hot Jupiters and such and so forth. And those are conditions which are traditionally just really challenging to study in the lab. So we're able to now access in silico a whole range of chemistry which we're not able to capture in vitro. And I think that is really exciting. The codes that we have now, the computer models that we have now are far and away capable of reproducing faithfully what we know to happen through experiments and to extrapolate far beyond that as well. So I think we've got the building blocks within the chemical sciences to make some developments in this area. One of the key developments that my group work on and that Liba talked about is what we call Earth system models. These models, I think, will increasingly be developed to go beyond Earth and to be used as numerical simulators of exoplanets and other planetary systems. I think we're in a great place, and this is a great time right now in Cambridge because we've pioneered actually the development of many of these codes, and I think this is a great time to be able to collaborate with the colleagues across the spectrum here in expanding what we're doing currently from Earth's perspective onto exoplanets.
Thank you very much, Alex. Nick, would you like to give the perspective from your own work and also that of Earth Sciences, please?
Sure. So first off, thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a pleasure to represent what is a very broad discipline, that is the earth sciences. I guess I'll start off by saying that it's an exciting time to be an earth scientist because of the developments that Didier mentioned at the very beginning, the developments coming from work in prebiotic chemistry, the developments in solar system exploration, and then also the developments coming from astrophysics, the field of exoplanet research. But also, Cambridge is a really exciting place to be an earth scientist because all of these developments are being led by researchers at this university. And that's part of why participating in this initiative is so exciting for me personally, but is equally exciting for my colleagues across the spectrum. I think there are at least three areas where earth sciences sort of integrates with the research that's going on under the broad umbrella of the center. I think the first area relates to prebiotic chemistry. So there's been a surge of groundbreaking research that's being led right here in Cambridge on the chemical pathways that produce the building blocks for life. And with those chemical pathways, although some of those chemical pathways appear promising and perhaps viable, the natural question is, what's the role of the environment in facilitating or even frustrating those chemical pathways and the processes required to generate the building blocks, and then, of course, to allow them to assemble together to more complex molecular structures. And the question of the role of the environment has been an attractive one for quite some time, but earth sciences has sort of lagged behind the chemists in addressing this question for the simple reason that our own planet has destroyed the earliest records of ancient environments on the Earth. And that's largely because our planet experiences plate tectonics, right? So plate tectonics is a mechanism which does many things for our planet, but one of the unfortunate things it does is it tends to destroy large portions of the crust and sedimentary deposits in particular. And so, in a way, answering the role of the environment and facilitating prebiotic chemistry is limited by observation. We simply don't have enough rocks, and we don't have enough well-preserved rocks to really understand the dynamics of the environments that were around at the time and how those environments might have evolved. Now, there's been some really interesting and important advances on that front, led mainly through theory. Of course, theory is an important perspective here in the absence of observation. But I think one thing that's really changed the ball game in terms of environments, the diversity and dynamics of environments that could be present on the early Earth and indeed on other rocky planetary bodies, is the realization that Mars is perhaps the best place that we should go to access that record. To put it simply, Mars contains a geological record that exists nowhere else in the solar system. It is the geological record that we wish was preserved on the early Earth, or on the Earth, but it's not. And this realization has come from the last 10 years of solar system exploration. So from orbiting and landed missions to Mars, we've now discovered that preserved right at the very surface of Mars is an expansive record of sedimentary rocks that chronicle the chemical and physical development of Mars early in its history, right around the same time when life was developing on the Earth. And so in that regard, if we can access that sedimentary record and understand the chemistry and physics of those environments and how that's related to planetary evolution, we can be in a position to test hypotheses related to the role of the environment in potentially facilitating prebiotic chemistry. But then, of course, Mars also offers an important case study in the capacity of planetary or just planets in general to facilitate the emergence of life in its own right. And so naturally, we're interested in the question of whether or not Mars could have ever hosted life. If so, that discovery in itself would have profound consequences for the distribution of life throughout the universe, because it would signal to us that the recipe for making life is not as complicated as we had anticipated, and perhaps by that logic, life could perhaps be more widely distributed throughout the universe, or at least in rocky planetary bodies. But if not, if we could safely conclude that Mars never hosted life, that's equally important, because we can then ask, why not? What were the reasons why? Was it the role of the environment? Was it the broader planetary trajectory? And so we can be specific about the things that are good and bad for planetary surfaces that make them suitable for life. So I think that's an important area where Earth sciences can contribute, and one in which we can interact with our colleagues in chemistry. Another area, of course, is on the exoplanet front. The observations coming from exoplanetary science, are handing some fascinating questions and considerations to Earth sciences. So, for example, if you observe a planet of a particular size and a particular proximity to its host star, what is the distribution of environments on the surface? What is the structure of the interior if we know broad aspects of the planet's composition? And even more broadly, what is the evolutionary trajectory of planets as a system? How do they evolve as a function of size and composition? These are very basic questions, but we're some ways away from coming up with a coherent theory, partly because we're still struggling to figure out those questions in the context of our own planet. And so these are really exciting questions to think about, and ones that we're really excited to work with our colleagues in astrophysics on. I think the third area that's really exciting, it represents an exciting frontier for Earth sciences that's very relevant to this center, is the degree to which environments and life co-evolve on planetary surfaces. We have one example of which life and environments co-evolved, and that's the Earth. And so the question, or one of the questions that we ask as Earth scientists, is how did life get to the point where it could start to influence and indeed regulate its own environment, and actually make the environment more suitable to thrive and end up creating particular environmental niches? And those are questions that need to be answered by looking deep into Earth's history and understanding the history of life on our own planet, the interaction between life and environments, and the products of life, or the signatures of life, that are recorded in planetary atmospheres. And so understanding the dynamics of that very complicated process, and I believe Emily's going to speak in a bit more detail about this, really provides our colleagues in astrophysics with a more deeper understanding of the degree to which life can influence broader planetary properties. So I guess those are some of the areas that I think represent exciting frontiers for Earth sciences and opportunities for collaboration under the umbrella of the center. And there are many others, but I'll sort of leave it there for the moment. Perhaps we can come back to some others.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. And I think that is now over to you, Emily. We've heard about identifying planets and what their atmospheres might be like and what the planets themselves might be like. But of course, one of the questions that we all have is, what about life?
Indeed, and it's lovely to be here to be discussing these things, life in the universe, with you all. So of course, when we're looking for life in the universe, we need to be able to detect it. In order to be able to detect it, we need to have some idea of what we're looking for, so the nature of life. How do we work out what the nature of life would be on other planets? Well, first step is to try and understand the history of life on Earth. So when we're thinking about the history of life on Earth, we often think in terms of biological complexity. So how do cells and organisms change, sometimes at the molecular level, in order to make evolutionary innovations? However, we're taking a slightly different point of view and looking instead at ecological complexity. So that's what evolutionary innovations occur that give life the power to make a step change in how much they can influence and change their environment. So that's ecological complexity. So here on Earth, we've had 4 such transitions. We have the creation of the biosphere with the emergence of life around 4 billion years ago. We then have the oxygenation of the atmosphere through photosynthesis of cyanobacteria around 2 billion years ago. Then, around 600 million years ago, we have the evolution of animals and their ability to transform the world through their movements and churning up the oceans, for example, to oxygenate it. Then, finally, we have the transition of how the land has been transformed as it was colonized. So each of these changes in terms of ecological complexity translates different changes in terms of the planetary environment. And these can be detected potentially in exoplanets in the form of biosignatures. So that's differences in the atmosphere that can only really be attributed to biological entities. So as a first point, we can think of Earth as a null model. So given an exoplanet that's potentially habitable and its age, we can make a prediction about what phase of ecological complexity it's likely to be in. And so what biosignatures could we expect to find there? Assuming, of course, that evolution would proceed at a similar rate that it does on Earth. Now, is this a fair thing to say? Well, from a pragmatic point of view, we've only got n=1 at the moment. It's the life on Earth is all that we've got, so it's a good enough place to start. But more generally, if we're thinking about what evolution looks like across the universe, there are two aspects when we're comparing to Earth. The first is the pace of evolution. The various different ecological transitions that we've experienced, did they happen at over relatively long timescales to what we might expect to find elsewhere, or shorter? There's also the inevitability of them. Each of these ecological transitions that we see, are they inevitable and they're going to happen regardless of wherever you are in the universe, or are they special to Earth? And what I find particularly interesting with my research is thinking about these timescales and how the fact that we had 3 billion years of life on Earth before we got animals. So we don't see animals appear in the fossil record to around 600 million years. And why we have this really large time gap, to me, is one of the most fundamental questions of evolutionary biology. We have no idea whether we are very lucky to be here and it's actually really difficult to get animals, or actually we took far longer than perhaps we should have done. But because we don't understand the origins of animals and we don't know how likely they are to be elsewhere, we don't know whether a similar age of habitable planet, there should be much more complex life or less. In a similar vein, we're not sure about technological species such as humans. Are we inevitable given animals or not? We're not sure. So these are very much key evolutionary biology questions, and there's this wonderful potential, if you get really lucky, to address them by looking at multiple different biosignatures across multiple different exoplanets. So the idea is that because we have these different phases of evolution, so we have the origins, biological oxygenation, animals, humans, we can compare the biosignatures that each of these phases will produce in terms of the number of them across different exoplanets with life and the type of biosignatures we're seeing. And the idea is that we can compare these predictions to evolutionary models to see whether or not we get more or less than we'd expect if things proceed as they do here on Earth. And there's this wonderful potential that we might get different proportions and actually things very, very variable depending on where we are. And if we do manage to end up getting this, where you have multiple different biosignatures across many, many exoplanets, we can then start to investigate the timings and likelihood of each of these really major evolutionary transitions. And this enables us to address these fundamental questions of how inevitable humans are here on Earth. And indeed, more generally, kind of how much of life's rich tapestry is just an inevitable function of a very dull evolutionary model that's inevitable once we get life, or whether we need something different, something bigger and more special in order to get these very, very big jumps in evolution. And that's what makes, I think, this initiative and looking for life in the universe quite so exciting for evolutionary biologists, as we can start to address potentially these really big fundamental questions.
Thank you very much, all of you, for sharing your insights from your own work and also from your own disciplines. Well, you know that I'm an historian, and we've already mentioned that people have been thinking about these sorts of questions for a very long time. But I'd like to think ahead to the future now, to my future fellow historians of science 50 years from now or 100 years from now, when they look back to this day in Cambridge in 2021, and they know that there was an historic event. They're going to ask, why now? Why was this initiative launched in Cambridge on this day now? You've hinted, but I'd like to hear something a little bit more explicit.
So I think one clear answer is the fact that there have been simultaneous revolutions in allied disciplines, all kind of reaching a crescendo over the last few years. The so-called exoplanet revolution, the advances in prebiotic chemistry that we mentioned before, and solar system exploration. These have all been revolutions within their own disciplines that have had profound impacts on other disciplines. And we've reached the point now where the next few years are going to promise some very exciting results, right? So we've already seen some enormous advances, but the next few years are going to be, we hope, even more significant. So to give an example, the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover is now sampling and storing samples on the surface of Mars, and they're going to be returned within the next 10 years. The missions that will be launched to return those samples are already in development, and they have to be launched by a certain time to take advantage of planetary motion. And so within 10 years, we'll have the opportunity to really know whether traces of ancient microbial life are present in those samples. At the same time, high-powered telescopes like the James Webb Space Telescope, for example, will be providing, perhaps the first remotely sensed detections of life recorded in planetary atmospheres. And so these are potentially big observations that demand a profound understanding of what life is, where it could be distributed in the universe, and how it could emerge from planetary surfaces. And so, I probably speak for all of us when I say that there couldn't be a better time to start getting together to really drill into the details here and develop, what we hope is a deeper understanding of life in the universe.
Thank you for that. I don't know if anyone would you like to come in, Madhu?
Yeah, on the astronomy side, I perfectly agree with what Nick just mentioned, is that what we are doing here sort of is the trend in the broader field as well. There are many initiatives happening around the world, different institutions coming together to answer interdisciplinary questions. But I think Cambridge is unique in the sense that we have very strong expertise across all these areas within the same institution. That we could have such an initiative within one institution is really remarkable. And to just give you a sense of scale for what's happening in astronomy, within this decade, literally within this decade, there will be 5 space missions operating to detect, 2 or 3 space missions to actually detect planets around nearby stars. And then another 3 missions. The James Webb Space Telescope, Hubble, has been operating for a while. And then there will be another Space Telescope, Ariel, towards the end of this decade. So within the same decade, there will be 3 space missions looking at atmospheres of planets, right? So this sort of opportunity has never happened before. So it's sort of the perfect moment for something like this to happen. And we totally have to sort of seize the opportunity to make those big advances.
Can I just jump in as well? So, agree completely. The other thing is tools and techniques are available now that weren't available before that really underpin some of this, so technologies as well. But the thing that strikes me is that this is a great example maybe of self-assembly. This isn't something that's come from up on high and directed us to do this. This is a fundamental case of what being an academic is all about. It's exciting things that we all have, some slice of the Venn diagram that we're representing here today. And I think that's really exciting.
Sounds like the moment. Emily?
Well, I couldn't agree more. It's a very, very exciting time to be thinking about these things and waiting to see what we find. The biologists step in once the life is found, right?
Now that this is happening, you make it sound easy in a certain way. And yet I don't have the feeling really that it's going to be so easy. There certainly must be some challenges involved in this. And once again, wearing my hat as an historian of science, I'd like a sneak preview, please, on what do those challenges look like at this point in time.
So my 2 cents on some of the challenges are connected with all of this is we live in this world of big data, right? We're just surrounded by data, but the conversion of data to information is a really tough thing. Right now, our different disciplines are probably spewing out hundreds of papers a week. There's no way, mere mortals can stay on top of a literature that connects us all together. So I think that's a huge challenge in anything that's interdisciplinary is actually accessing the collective knowledge of those disciplines together and synthesizing it. But that's what initiatives are for, right? And that's really what programs like this can do is bring us together. I think the 101s and all the things that Mejd talked about are excellent examples of how we can collectively upskill from where we are. But of course, there are structural barriers and challenges as well, and maybe I'll leave that to somebody else to talk about.
Well, yeah, certainly. It's structural barriers in the sense that, historically, departments have been centered around one particular discipline, and even though disciplines, over the last few decades of just getting broader and broader, I guess the question is, how can we feasibly work together, even though we reside in different departments? And we've all had a great deal of discussion about this, in the realm of the center. I mean, and there are some excellent suggestions. So for example, embedding researchers, from one department in another laboratory in a different department, involving colleagues from arts and humanities to actually step in and ask about the degree to which we rely on concepts that could themselves do with additional examination. What do you mean when you say alive? What do you mean when you say cradle? What sort of connotations do these words have, and how can we, how can we use those in a more productive way? And I guess related to that, another set of challenges is, of course, communication, right? I mean, we all reside in different disciplines, and we speak a slightly different language, I guess, for the purposes of efficiency of communication, right? I can talk to my colleagues in earth sciences a bit more efficiently if I use jargon. But we need to get around this well-known barrier if we're really going to make progress on truly interdisciplinary work. And so spending time learning each other's languages, not being afraid to ask the obvious question of, well, can you just stop and define what that term means, is going to be crucial to this endeavor. And again, I mean, colleagues in arts and humanities can potentially play a role here, because they can ask the questions that might seem too obvious for the physical science cohort to ask. So yeah, the communication barriers, the structural barriers, for sure. I guess the only other barrier I can think of is a financial one, or a funding barrier. Alex alluded to this, but that the research councils have a particular remit that has clear bounds, but these purely curiosity-driven questions that really do span multiple disciplines, it's difficult to find the right venue to support this kind of work. And this is one of the principal reasons why we decided to get together and do something about it. So hopefully with continued collaboration, we can make some progress in getting around these.
Thanks very much. So I'm almost getting the feeling that some, if not all of you, are going to want to come and spend time on Free School Lane in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science to, talk about neologisms and jargon and scientific terminology, or maybe wander down the street and talk to the anthropologists. So you all come from different backgrounds. Well, we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different sorts of training. It's a very exciting initiative that is at its core cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary. What sort of research initiatives do you see coming out of this, in addition to thinking about exoplanets, planetary science, and life? Do you see other things too coming out of it? Because it's, you're touching on some things that go beyond, I think, just the scientific community.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so working in exoplanets that I've come to become very cautious about is sticking to dogmas. In exoplanet science, there is no dogma to stick to. The field is so young. We didn't know of other planets until 25, 30 years ago. But it's psychologically, it's amazing to see that even in a field this young, dogmas can become established on short time scales. Like when the first I'll go a little bit into a philosophical realm here, but like when the first exoplanets were discovered, you discover hot Jupiters, and people would be like, no, this can't be possible. You can't have hot Jupiters. And then people argue for some years, and they're like, okay, this is really a planet. It exists. And then now, if you talk about hot Jupiters, it's very common. But if you talk about another new kind of planet, there is still as much resistance as there was about hot Jupiters, not realizing that we don't have any fundamental knowledge about diversity of planetary systems, or how diverse they can be on any aspect. So the fundamental challenge is just to remain open about anything and everything. So I thought I should mention that because it's very easy to fall into that trap. And we see this with notions of habitability. We have been thinking of Earth-like planets, so we want to look at Earth-like planets, but the universe, can allow for a much wider range of possibilities. For the kind of breakthroughs you're talking about that we foresee, or we should foresee coming, are breakthroughs at the intersections between these disciplines and think beyond what we are used to thinking. And this is a perfect field to be in for that sort of activity, because it's literally infinite, and it's at the the scope is infinite, and we are at the very beginning of it. So what better place to be at Cambridge than to make seminal advances at the intersections of these areas?
Well, I know that I've asked a lot of questions already, and I have more questions that I'd like to ask, and there will be opportunity for that, I'm sure, also when we go for some refreshments. But I'd like to open this up to the audience. Members of the audience, I'm sure, have all sorts of questions that you'd like to ask too. And we have some microphones, and if you just want to wave or raise your hand so that we can see who would like one.
So my question is really about biosignatures. So what do you consider to be a robust biosignature that you could detect on an exoplanet? And how do we know life when we see it, basically?
Yeah, so traditionally people, for Earth-like planets, people have, some norms. For example, you ought to see a multitude of species, not just any one chemical, but methane plus oxygen plus nitrous oxide, some combination like that. Just based on an Earth-centric view. But more recently, there have been suggestions of focusing on secondary biomarkers. These are produced in small quantities and are exclusively traceable to life on Earth. For example, chemicals like methyl chloride or dimethyl sulfide are thought to be produced mostly by life here on Earth, but traditionally, they have not been considered because they're produced in very small quantities, maybe like a part per million or even lower. Yeah. So traditionally, it was a problem. But what we are now thinking is with facilities like the James Webb Space Telescope and slightly larger planets than Earth, we might enter a regime where those might be detectable. So where we could potentially detect chemicals at a part per million, even at concentrations of part per million, so that might add to the robustness in my personal view.
Well, I was just gonna comment as well. From a chemistry perspective, disequilibrium is always something that we're looking for. Fundamentally, isotopes provide a nice view as well on processes that you might say life is involved in. Whether or not, we struggle at the moment, right, to see methane isotopes in our atmosphere from space. And we're pretty close to it. So what the scope is for seeing some of those isotopes on exoplanets, I don't know. But
slightly difficult.
Yeah, I imagine.
And Emily, do you want to say anything about what life might look like?
Well, I find it a fascinating thing to think about, both in terms of biosignatures, what we might find, but also the relative volumes of biosignatures and what that might equate to, and what that means for understanding of evolution. So most of life on Earth has been microbial. Most of life alive today is green and photosynthetic, and generally quite small. Most of the oxygen produced on Earth is from the oceans, from phytoplankton rather than anything else. So there's a huge potential for life to exist on other planets in vast quantities, but not really be that interesting, just to be relatively simple and not the kind of exciting animals that we are.
And can I ask you, how will you know life when you see it?
How will I know life?
Yes, from the standpoint of biology.
Well, so I think we have to rely on biosignatures when we're looking for life in the universe. We can fantasize about being able to go and get samples, but I think that's very much a fantasy, really, at this point.
Thank you for that. I will say, and I mentioned this to Emily when we were talking about our meeting today, that I had never heard the term biosignature before. And Didier mentioned jargon. I think you did too, Nick. And this is one of the interesting things and one of the challenges, of course, as you've all pointed out, about this sort of interdisciplinary work. Saw a question, a hand up in the second. You've got a microphone. Great.
This is a question primarily for for both Nick and Emily, and it's about, Mars, the way that you're talking about it seems like such a wonderful sort of fossil and such a wonderful sort of record, potentially for prebiotic chemistry and for early life. And it may be the best that we have, but how do we know that that's a good analog for Earth? And is there anything that we can say about Earth and how life evolved on Earth that could help us to know whether that really is a good comparison or whether we're just learning about Mars by looking at Mars?
So I think in some aspects we are really just learning about Mars because there are some processes that were undoubtedly unique to Mars that probably didn't play a role on the Earth. Some examples of where there's crossover between the two could be how certain planetary processes or processes that occur that might have occurred early in the Earth are recorded in sediments. I mean, I sort of was very dismissive of the earliest sedimentary record of the Earth, but there are indeed sediments and successions that are reasonably well preserved, such that they can be accessed. But we don't really have a good sense of what processes were going on at that time that could have been archived or recorded in sediments, but we do on Mars. So I'm thinking in particular of large impacts, large volcanic provinces. I mean, we have very clear records of these processes, from the record on early Mars, and we can actually understand how those processes are archived in the sediments. And even more than that, we can start to ask how those processes might have influenced climate, right, on short and long timescales. And that's something that's very relevant to understanding the early Earth, right? So we can then go back to the sedimentary record on Earth and ask, well, are impacts actually archived in sedimentary sequences, and what could be the climate response to impacts? We can use those lessons learned from Mars exploration to really understand that. And indeed, impacts in volcanism are enormously important factors, in the realm of geologic time that we're talking about, and they have to have been important in the earliest record on Earth, but we don't quite know how to find traces of those on the Earth.
Emily, I think there was a question for you there too.
Well, so it's very easy to think from kind of outside paleontology, for example, that we know animals are found in the fossil record around 600 million years ago, but we know what was preserved before that. But we actually have an incredibly rich microfossil record that goes back 3.5 billion years or so. And so if we're finding microfossils here on Earth, then there's that potential to be finding them in rocks that we bring back from Mars. And it's we'll have to wait and see what happens. But it's there is that record on Earth of fossils that we can't see with the naked eye, that we wouldn't be able to see on Mars unless we actually get the rocks back and start examining them and studying them here, hopefully in Cambridge.
Great, thank you. I see a hand up in the second row from the back.
We're having this great revolution about the habitability of other planets at a time when our own planet is becoming rapidly less habitable. And I was wondering if you had any discussion of the prospects of this fantastic new interdisciplinary collaboration for addressing that problem, the climate crisis.
Well, I'd say partly it's the communication across disciplines. So the solutions to the climate crisis aren't going to be solved by people at the Met Office, right? They're going to be solved by people across the whole spectrum of society and science working together. And that might involve some out-of-the-box thinking. So, it might involve some basic understanding of how ecology might adapt to maximize different niches. So I think things like this bring people together to think about questions that they don't anticipate the answers to having an impact somewhere else. And that's probably, I don't know the history of science very well, but I'm sure that's something that's kind of true of the history of science. When you bring people together, they discover things they never thought they would have.
We have a term for it, cross-fertilization.
There we go.
Actually, I mean, it's one of the things that is studied is when you bring scientists together from different disciplinary backgrounds and training, different labs even, you can have the creation of a new field in science. Think of biochemistry, for instance, just one example. So, but coming back to the question, anything from biological sciences, earth sciences?
Yeah, I mean, well, something to build on what Alex said, that the out-of-the-box thinking and understanding planetary climates broadly, I think, can contribute to that problem. So in earth sciences, one of the ways in which earth scientists or geologists in particular can help address this problem is by asking what climate perturbations has the earth already experienced in its past. And there are indeed episodes of significant outbursts of CO2 that are recorded in fine-grained sediments where you can see the time scale and the response of Earth's climate at that time. Now, the comparison to the modern climate is a lot more difficult for obvious reasons, but nevertheless, there is an observational record there to be explored and understood in the broader context of how do planetary climates work. So, so I think in the general realm of understanding the boundaries of planetary climates, I think many of the folks within this center, may be in a position to contribute to that problem. And in fact, climate modeling is something that I know the Department of Earth Sciences is placing a high strategic importance on. For the reasons that I just mentioned, we would like to attract more colleagues that can contribute science, both that's societally relevant, and then also the sort of blue skies, curiosity-driven science that can address some of the problems that we're talking about here. So we see some commonality in those problems.
Could I just give one other sort of firm example, and it kind of connects to Astro, actually. So the model that we developed is called the UKCA Chemistry and Aerosol Model. So that basically has helped us understand the methane pledge, which was announced last week about how we need to cut methane. And at the core of that model is actually a piece of Fortran code that was developed in the astrophysics lab in the 90s, which solves all of the differential equations. So, in terms of impact case studies, I'm sure astrophysics should probably be aware of how that code has propagated through different hands and is now informing global policy.
So I think it's quite tempting to start thinking about living on Mars, for example. I know lots of billionaires are quite keen on the idea, but it's still very hard to kind of impress to people sometimes just quite how difficult that will be. And even though things aren't looking good for our planet, they're still a lot better and a lot easier to live than somewhere like Mars. So let's not write off Earth just yet.
So I see a question here.
All of you have alluded to the fact that very little is known about the diversity and nature of the kind of questions that we're addressing, or at least fully it's not known. And you've talked about thinking beyond the box and thinking beyond what we're familiar with. So I'm just curious on your thoughts and approach on how do you go about it, or how does one go about informing sort of thinking about the unknown and thinking about what could be, and how do you approach that question within your own fields? Thank you.
As a modeler, I love the unknown because I can't be proven wrong, right? So that's also the appeal of exoplanetary chemistry. Unlike working on Earth, where there's lots of observations, but I think it's how do I go about that? How do we go about that? I mean, I think I don't have a succinct answer, but I think that's the most exciting thing that we are doing. It's the stuff that's off the Gantt chart, really, that keeps me awake at 6 a.m.
So if I may add, I had a few experiences like this actually, so I can talk to your question. One of the first things to do is to shed as many assumptions one makes as possible. So every time you try to interpret some data, you start with some sort of a model. And many times we make some assumptions in building a model, be it equilibrium or something. You have to make some assumptions. And those assumptions, it's mostly historical. The reason we make those assumptions, and we are trained to make certain assumptions from our undergraduate and graduate courses and so on. But when you enter into a new field like this, be it exoplanet science or any cutting edge field, one of the hardest things to do, so one has to be conscious about it, is to shed as many of those assumptions as possible and see if you can still make a consistent theory in explaining a certain observation, for example. And many times the breakthroughs, lie at those sorts of intersections between making an assumption and not.
I don't know if the other one of the two of you want to add something. If not, we have a question that's waiting over there.
Is there any reason why it's a good idea to send humans to Mars or to the moon? Like, for example, is there science you can do that's justified that you can't do with robots?
Yeah, on human exploration, this has been a longer-term goal for NASA. I think that's driven more by breaking through engineering barriers rather than scientific. I think NASA and the European Space Agency has proven that robotic exploration really delivers maximum scientific impact, given budgetary constraints. As a scientist interested in these problems, I am entirely happy with that approach. And I have no desire myself to visit Mars, although I'm very curious about its history. I think much of the exploration that we need to do can, in fact, be done by the robots that are there. I will say, though, that the data that are being collected by the Perseverance rover will not solve the question of whether or not life is recorded in those rocks. It just simply can't produce the type of data that we need. We need to get the samples back to laboratories on Earth to really know for sure. And that said, even sort of recognizing how life is archived in ancient sediments on Earth presents a challenge. We can pick up a handful of sedimentary rocks deposited billions of years ago and not find any trace of life at all. But we know that microbial life existed at that time. So there are plenty of complications to deal with even once we get the samples back, and I'm not really sure that sending humans to Mars serves any scientific purpose. I think there are plenty of engineering demonstrations that could potentially be done with human activities on Mars, but at least concerning the scientific questions that we're talking about, I'm perfectly happy with robotic exploration at the moment because that seems to fit the budget.
Does astronomy or chemistry want to come in on that?
No, we are fine here.
Okay, good with robots. Okay, I see a question here.
Well, life in the universe is obviously a very hot topic, and so there's often like controversy when like a planet and there's something about habitability or whatever in a paper, which is very scientific and like constrained, but then the media picks up on it and it becomes like blown up and they're like, oh, Earth 2.0, new habitable planet, etc. Does this initiative have like ideas about like dealing with media and like public perception of this topic?
That's a very difficult question. It's very difficult, and it's not. I mean, it's a human psychology question, and the best we can do is be very careful with what we like. As scientists, we have to be responsible in presenting our results. And with that said, I actually think much of the media is quite sensible, and they'll take. If you put a lot of caveats in your press release, they will take it. But then there will always be a section of media which will, blow it off to infinity. So that you can't do much about. But there is another aspect which you didn't touch upon, which is social media. That's not formal media, right? So it's social media, and there you're just exposed to all kinds of opinions that you can never actually control. So I think, we don't have anything formal that we decided on this initiative, but generally, good scientific practice, when you put out a paper, the paper itself should include all the caveats, with your discovery, whatever finding, and then we make active efforts to factor that into, whatever press release as well. And I think that we should keep that sort of an approach and try our best to inform people about what the real science is.
So thank you for that. I think on that note, I'd like to turn to a couple of other questions because that was quite a provocative question. What is the media going to do when they hear about this launch? How are they going to interpret it, report it? And I'd like to ask, each of the panelists if you would speak to us about your vision for the future of this initiative, please.
My vision, I think, is to really integrate what we've been doing with Earth and Earth system models to beyond Earth, to this idea of having numerical simulators that really allow us the test bed to look at ideas, to throw away the constraints of old ways of thinking, and to really explore a lot of this parameter space. I think we're at an age now where the models that we have and the tools that we have are really phenomenal. I mean, all you have to do is, okay, maybe you won't agree with me, but look at your weather forecast. It's a phenomenal amount of knowledge that's been integrated into computer simulators. And so I'd really love us to take on the challenge and to collectively go beyond the Earth system models, basically, and create something like that.
So for my vision, I have a couple of boundary conditions which sort of drive my vision. Two really is that one is that my optimistic view is that by the end of this decade, roughly in 9-10 years time frame, I think it is conceivable that we would have detected a biosignature. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I see it being conceivable because I know the kind of facilities that are coming online and the kind of planners that are out there. So that's one end. But then there is the other end, which is the bare minimum, which is we know that we are going to measure some chemical abundances, be it a biosignature or not, for a number of small planets, small temperate planets. We are talking about roughly habitable zone type planets, slightly maybe bigger than Earth or so on. But we will measure some chemical abundances or chemicals, period, be it CO2 or methane or water vapor and so on. Between those two is a huge range of science that is required to be pursued to understand what those signatures mean. Right? So at the very minimum, we would be able to, if it's not a biosignature, then at the very minimum, we still need to understand the surface-atmosphere interactions, the geology of these planets, the interiors of these planets, the atmospheric process. There's a whole range of things that we need to understand. And even for that, for the bare minimum, we need an initiative like this, right? Across the board, multidisciplinary to understand. And for the best case scenario, we absolutely need an initiative like this. So my grand vision is at two stages. Ultimately is that maybe by the end of this decade, we might be able to come up with this holistic perspective where we're able to have an exoplanet system science equivalent, where we're able to touch upon all these aspects from biology to chemistry to earth science to geology and planetary atmospheres and their stars and the environment and so on, and be able to explain a biosignature that we are seeing, and possibly in multiple objects, right? Because Emily needs statistics. But at the very minimum, we would still have the same sort of architecture minus the life, but there is a lot of other things that we can also do. So that would be my grand vision for an initiative like this. And there are various breakthroughs that will happen in that process.
Thank you, Madhu. As you said, like the grand vision would be in, I guess, 20 years' time to have multiple biosignatures, which we can use to then constrain our understanding of evolution. But in the kind of shorter term, for me, it's very much about using kind of macro-evolutionary and macro-ecological models to try and work out when we do start detecting chemical signatures on other planets, is there a scenario where we could have life going on that we're not able to detect yet? And how would that integrate with the chemical signatures we're seeing? And so to try and model these things from a very theoretical standpoint to get a better understanding of what we may be missing to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, my vision for the center doesn't really differ a whole lot from what's already been said. I mean, aside from the fact that, several of us are involved in, some really fascinating discovery-led science, whether it's through solar system exploration or whether it's happening, right in the chemistry laboratories or whether it's happening numerically. And, I think all we have to do is get together and, I think Cambridge can be a really important part of the conversation on, life, what life is, the history of life, how it interacts with the environment, and how it might be distributed in the universe. And so I think scientifically that's probably, the most optimistic part of the vision. But I guess there's another aspect of it too, which is training the future generation. And I think just getting together and agreeing that we want to become more fluent in each other's science means that we can impart those principles on the next generation. And so I hope that by engaging in this intellectual activity, we can sort of cultivate a new generation of scholars who can ask good questions and who can use their training in physics, chemistry, mathematics, and earth sciences to really do groundbreaking science in a way that they maybe couldn't do elsewhere.
Well, I did notice that it's almost time for us to wrap up. I want to say how exciting it's been for me, really how thrilling to be part of this conversation with the four of you. I've enjoyed it very, very much. More importantly, I've learned a great deal as well. And it's also been very inspiring to look around the audience and to see how many younger people are here. And I think that for me, this is also very inspiring as well. And as an historian of science, I have to say that I feel that we are here at a truly revolutionary moment. And I'm thrilled to have been part of the launch, and I look forward to hearing all of the great science that you do and the various breakthroughs that the initiative makes. Thanks very much.